Good evening. And for those of you who are arriving, we are letting our guests in. All attendees and panelists are assembled. And this is the Houston 2020 Visions Lecture Series with a panel discussion regarding the future of the energy economy. I'm Councilmember David Robinson, also a licensed architect and proud member of AIA Houston. This is the next in a series of panel discussions related to the 2020 Visions exhibit. And tonight's discussion is one that I know we have been looking very forward to at the chapter. And it is one that will feature four outstanding speakers. The moderator tonight is the chair of our jury for this process, none other than Bob Berkebile, FAIA. Bob has become a dear friend, but he is a principal emeritus of the Kansas City-based firm BNIM, a stalwart leader in the movement for sustainable architecture. Bob was the original chair of the AIA National's Committee on the Environment and continues to be a great champion of the green movement. Bob will be moderating the panel tonight with three experts, two of whom are native locals, or at least here to stay, and another is come aboard recently, and we will hear about her in a moment. But let me start by our first speaker. This evening will be Bobby Tudor, who's the chairman of Tudor, Pickering and Holt, and the immediate past president of Houston's Greater Houston Partnership, leading energy investment firm here in the city of Houston. And along with Bobby will be Jim Blackburn, expert environmental attorney and ecologist. This is the gentleman who is the co-director of the Severe Storm Prediction, Education, and Evacuation from Disaster Center. That's the SPEED Center to you and I. He's a Rice University Baker Institute scholar and a professor of practice in environmental law. And then finally, our third guest is Dr. Emily Reichert. She's the CEO of Greentown Labs, which is new to Houston, but a think tank and startup facility that has headquarters in Somerville, Mass. Greentown Labs is the centerpiece of the Rice University Innovation District here in Midtown, alongside the wonderful new ION facility that is featured in the Architecture Houston exhibit. So with that, I would like to mention just that this is the final cluster of projects that is represented in the exhibit on display at AIA Houston. And for those who have not yet been, there is a way to get a reservation and get downtown. That's by emailing Debbie, that's DEBBY, at aiahouston.org to schedule a time to visit the show. And with that, I believe I'd like to turn it over to the moderator of the panel, none other than Bob Berkebile. Bob, I'd like for you to turn on your camera and take it away, my friend.
Thanks, David, so much. And thanks especially to Houston AIA and the city of Houston for raising this important question about Houston's future. And thanks to my fellow jurors who gathered in 2019, it seems like light years ago, to look at the results of this work, and especially the creative teams who submitted ideas that will forever reduce the impact of climate change and make Houston more efficient, connected, resilient, and equitable. The inspiring designs reminded us of the courage and leadership of the city's founders and the creativity of the entrepreneurs who made Houston the global capital for energy and financial systems. Had they been confronted with the reality of climate change, it seems clear that they would have looked at these issues together with the pandemic and ongoing struggle for racial equity and created a new design and business plan to address the greatest challenges and opportunities in Houston's history. Next, please. This, as you can see, is the more or less typical curve that looks at either nature, natural systems, or human-made systems, comparing vitality to time. And so let's imagine, as terms of a natural system, this is an oak tree or oak forest. In the beginning, the acorn is requiring from the soil water, nutrients, and giving nothing back. But over time, using only the sun and rain, the oak tree and later oak forest provide habitat for millions, together with the air, water, and soil management and sequestering vast amounts of carbon. As the forest matures, diversity and vitality decline. So let's consider this as a human system. If the human system is Houston, when it was the hydrocarbon capital of the world, including today, delivering fuel, technology, and financial systems to the rest of the world, there's a lot of vitality. But over time, as the release of carbon and methane contributed to climate change, and climate change delivered impacts like Harvey, Laura, and the recent freeze, while renewables like especially wind and solar have become less costly, without the climate impacts, this curve changes. Next, please. Often there's a disruptive event. In the case of a natural system, and go back to the oak forest, a forest fire will regenerate diversity dramatically and increase the vitality of both the forest and the ecosystems connected thereto. If it's a human system, let's go back to your community in Houston, the question I would raise is the disruption of climate change, Harvey, Laura, and the freeze, the pandemic and all the brokenness it revealed, and the cyber attack of the Colonial Pipeline enough to trigger regenerative response in Houston? Next, please. You know, in some ways, carbon has gotten a bad name by many of us environmentalists, but we have to remind ourselves that both the planet and we are carbon-based systems. We inherited a planet that had a perfectly balanced carbon system, and nature is always working to create balance. But the powerful hydrocarbon economy, led by Houston and embraced globally, exported massive amounts of carbon to the atmosphere, as you see in the central image. The real challenge today, or I would like to think of it as the opportunity, is to create the systems that invite it back, to import that carbon back where it belongs through regenerative agriculture, land management, technology, and financial management. That's the real opportunity. And the opportunity is even greater because we have very little time to do that. We can't solve the whole problem in a decade, but if we don't make dramatic change in this decade, it will dramatically limit the future of our descendants. Next, please. Einstein said several things that I think are relevant to this conversation. The first is, the problem is we've created the illusion of seeing ourselves as separate from nature. The second was doing the same thing over and over and expecting different outcome is the definition of stupidity. And then finally, the one on the screen is, I think, most relevant for this conversation. And that is, of course, we shall require substantially a new manner of thinking if mankind, or you could say, should say, humankind is to survive. Next, please. So I have done a number of exercises recently to try to get a sense of what kind of dramatic change is required to think differently enough to create the desired outcome. And this was one of my exercises on a Florida beach. I found that even though I've spent 40 years now trying to reduce my footprint, by reducing the carbon emitted by buildings and communities where I've been involved as a designer. I found that by walking on my hands on the beach, I entirely eliminated my footprints. And something that wasn't apparent at the time, but has become apparent, it also placed my heart above my head, or gave the heart priority, which intuitively I believe has been a significant part of the problem. And then finally, it dramatically increased my handprints. So think of footprints as decreasing, as doing less bad, and handprints as creating new ideas or systems to solve the most critical problems, or doing something positive. So I'm really excited about the fact that this evening we have 3 unique presenters who have moved way beyond footprints to handprints long ago. And they all use Einstein's new manner of thinking, and they each have unique views about Houston's opportunity. David's already introduced them, but let me start by inviting Bobby Tudor to kick us off.
Well, thank you, Bob and David. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here this evening. Many of you know my wife, Phoebe, who's a preservation architect, and I have a daughter who's in graduate school at Rice in architecture. So I'm very, very connected to the architecture community in Houston, and really admire all the great work that you do. I hopefully will set the stage for the discussion this evening by talking about the energy economy, and broadly speaking, talking about money. Maybe not the expected place to start when we're talking about this issue, but it's very difficult ultimately to get to the kind of the heart of the problem and ultimately to the solutions without talking about the energy economy in Houston and money. So I have a handful of slides here that I'm going to zip through quickly, and then hopefully there'll be some questions when we all gather at the end here. So Jennifer, next slide, please. While this is somewhat obvious, probably it's worth repeating that Greater Houston, our region, has been a global energy leader for the last 100 years, with a legacy of innovation and resiliency and economic growth. Much is said about the degree to which Houston's economy has been diversified in the last few decades. I'm here to tell you that that's dramatically overstated. And in fact, whether you're an architect or own a dry cleaner or a travel agency or a bar, you are leveraged to the energy industry if you are in Houston, Texas. Out of the 128 publicly traded oil and gas production firms in the country, 44 are headquartered here. 14% of the nation's total refining production happens here. Bob referred to the Colonial Pipeline, which supplies refined products, gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel to the East Coast of the United States. That pipeline is headquartered here and starts here. About 44% of the US's total base petrochemical manufacturing capacity is here. And our port of Houston is the #1 port in Houston in the US by cargo volume, handling about 285 million tons of cargo in total last year. Much of that energy related. There are 21 Fortune 500 companies in Houston. 18 of them are energy companies. We are very, very highly leveraged as an economy to the energy industry. Next slide, please, Jennifer. This starts to put some numbers to it, all, if you will. This shows our employment, non-farm employment by sector. And so if you look at the 3 bars on the bottom of each of these bars, you'll see that direct employment in energy accounts for somewhere between 25 and 30%. And then if you go to the top bar, which is the light blue bar, that's what we call induced jobs. And induced jobs are jobs that are created through household spending that emanates from those energy jobs. So all in all, about 40% of the total jobs in Houston, a little more than that, are either direct or induced energy jobs. There's a lot of concentration in our economy and energy business, and you would have to look to finance in New York City or entertainment in Los Angeles to find any other major cities that are similarly tied to one single industry. And what this chart also tells you is that we actually have continued to grow our energy jobs over this period of time in absolute terms. And so energy has been and continues to be a very, very important part of the Houston economy. Next slide, Jennifer, please. There are some recent trends, however, that have challenged our leading position. I think all of you probably have heard of the shale revolution, that real kind of technological breakthrough in the energy business that made a lot of rock that had been heretofore uneconomic. It made it suddenly economic. That was an innovation driven in Houston by our very own George Mitchell, and it is the reason that Houston became a boom town from 2005 or so, really until 2019. With that came just incredible growth in every regard, certainly in jobs. However, in the 2018-2019 period, that all came to a screeching halt for a handful of different reasons, but primarily because the boom was a production boom, but not a profitability boom. And at the end of the day, capital has quit flowing to the industry. And so what we've seen is that we have lost about 200,000 total jobs in Greater Houston in energy during this period of time. And that's about the same number of jobs that have been lost over this period in total in Houston. So said differently, all of the job loss in Houston over the course of the past year, really from the year preceding the pandemic till today, has been in the energy industry. Next slide, please. To exacerbate that a bit, our leading companies have shrunk by about 25%. This has been largely driven by mergers and acquisitions, so consolidation in an industry. That often happens in industries when growth starts to run out. And so you have a lot of companies who, either because they need to survive, or because they went bankrupt, or because they're looking for economies of scale, decide to combine. And when that happens, we end up with consolidation that results in fewer companies. And so we have meaningfully fewer companies in the energy business in total today, actually, than we did in 2008 or so. You can see from the bars beginning in 08 till today exactly what's happened in that regard. Next slide, Jennifer, please. And what about climate change? Well, the other thing that's happening is we've had this kind of profit bust, if you will, in the energy business, is that we're also going through a period of transition in which, because of decreasing costs, non-hydrocarbon-based energy sources, in particular wind and solar, are taking a higher and higher percentage of the world's global energy mix. And so while today the renewable markets only account for about 14% of global energy demand, we would expect that by 2050 the number will look something more like 31%. And if you go down this chart, we would expect nuclear will hold about steady, natural gas actually will hold about steady, oil will decrease, and coal will decrease quite dramatically. Now, all of that is really good for global CO2 emissions going down. It's not so good necessarily if you're in the traditional hydrocarbon business, in particular the oil and coal business. And so it is that lack of growth and demand for those products that is driving the outlook for the energy economy in Houston. Next slide, please. So we've taken a look at the Greater Houston Partnership, and you guys are getting a little bit of a preview of a big piece that we'll be coming out with at the end of June that speaks to all this and speaks to the strategy for our region of becoming a leader in the new energy economy. But we've taken a look at three different cases here. One we're calling business as usual, which is effectively incremental technology improvements, a flat demand picture for traditional oil and gas over the course of the next 30 years. That's business as usual case. We have an accelerated transition case where it happens more quickly, and then something that we call the 1.5 degrees centigrade pathway, which would be completely aligned with the Paris Climate Accords. And our analysis would tell us that if you go all the way to the right-hand side of the page, you would say that if we don't adjust our energy economy in Houston, we could be faced with massive job losses. Even in the business as usual case, we would expect to lose about 250,000 total energy and energy-induced jobs in Houston over this period of time. And in the 1.5 degrees centigrade case, we could lose as many as 650,000 jobs if no actions are taken to respond to this changing energy landscape. Next slide, please. The good news, however, is that there is fantastic opportunity associated with this. And if Houston can, in fact, become a leader in the new energy economy, leveraging our current strengths, attracting new capital and new talent, we think that there is fantastic upside for us as a region. In the business as usual case, another, call it 225,000 jobs, and all the way on the far end to another, call it 600,000 additional jobs. And so the important message here is that there will be great growth associated with this energy transition. But for us to capture that growth and to continue to be the leader in the global energy economy, we're going to have to do some things differently. Next slide, please. So when we think about doing things differently, we've benchmarked Houston with other cities, and we've identified 5 core strengths. Here they are on the right-hand side of the page. A large engineering workforce that's technically trained with energy experience. We have existing large-scale energy and industrial infrastructure in place in our region. We have very significant renewable generation capacity already. I think most of you know that Texas is the leader in wind energy. And by the middle of 2021, we will be the leader in solar as well. We have a business-friendly ecosystem that provides the right environment for startups to scale. And we have a big logistics advantage because we have the largest U.S. port with global shipping connections, and with the widening of the Panama Canal, a real strategic advantage as regards our connectivity to Asia. However, next slide, please, Jennifer. We also have some existing disadvantages that we must overcome. And the first and an important one is that we need to improve the public perception that Houston and its business leaders are not enemies of the energy transition, but rather are embracing it and are seeking to become real difference makers and leaders for something that the world very much needs. We don't have what we would call good collective regional momentum around this issue. There is individual momentum in companies and in academic institutions and in our NGOs, but we don't feel that it's collective momentum, and that's something that needs to change. We don't have a world-class innovation ecosystem in Houston. There is a ton of innovation here, but it's historically happened in our largest, most complex companies, and there hasn't been as much innovation in technology sort of at the grassroots level. And we're going to get to that more in a moment with Emily. There's been limited industry-wide collaboration on this issue. I've had a CEO tell me that it's easier for him to get the CEO of Starbucks on the phone to talk about this than it is for him to get the CEO of ConocoPhillips on the phone to talk about it. And that's something that we can and should change. And then finally, there's a current gap in new energy skill sets. It's not, for example, necessarily true that every single engineer who works at a big oil company can walk across the street and do exactly the same thing as effectively at a new energy company. There is a lot of overlap and a lot of crossover, and we have a lot of brilliant, technically trained people, more engineers per capita than any other city in the country. But there is some current gap, and we're going to need to upskill and reskill a lot of our workforce. Next page, please. So what are we going to focus on? Kind of 3 different buckets here, areas where Houston has a big advantage, which are the ones at the top: carbon capture, use, and storage, a new hydrogen economy, the circular economy, which is to say end-to-end plastics recycling associated with our petrochemicals industry, and then battery manufacturing and storage, taking advantage of our expertise in material science and in logistics. We also want to attract and support companies that are in established new energy industries like renewables, solar, wind, biofuels, et cetera. Many of those largest players are already here, but we want more of them here. And then finally, we're going to look to deploy cross-cutting initiatives to attract and grow companies in all energy value chains. And those would include everything from electric vehicles and energy efficiency technologies to the decarbonization of the legacy natural gas and oil business, to geothermal, and to ecological-based solutions that you'll hear about in a moment from Jim Blackburn. Next page. So all this will be rolled out in full at the end of June. We're very excited about it. The future is bright for Houston in this space, but we are facing a dual challenge, and the dual challenge is to provide cleaner but still reliable and affordable energy to a growing world. And that's going to cost a lot of money, take a lot of creativity and innovation, and frankly, it's not going to happen unless Houston and our legacy energy industry takes ownership and leadership of making it happen. So I will stop there. Bob, back to you.
Thanks, Bobby. You gave us a lot of information in 15 minutes, so I look forward to discussing that. Next up is Jim Blackburn.
Thank you, Bob. And it's really nice to be here and talking about the future of the energy economy. And I want to add that ecology is going to be part of the energy economy, the way I see things. And I show here an image that Charles Tapley and I put together back in the late 1980s. Seems like the 1880s almost. In the late 1980s, we really had no real appreciation of the ecological resources that we have around Houston. And I'm not sure how much we have learned to use these resources, but I would offer that they are the key to the future. And what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of weaving ecology in terms of the future of the energy economy, both from a solution standpoint, and then interweaving it with resilience for the Houston region, which is another key part of the energy economy and its protection. And I'd like to dedicate this presentation to both Charles Tapley and to Tom Colbert, who worked with us on a lot of these early works that you'll hear a bit about. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Now, I want to start off with carbon capture and storage, and the image on the left is one of many concepts that are out there about how to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I would say the oil and gas industry is generally partial toward technological solutions. They think in terms of pumps and valves and various pieces of mechanical equipment. But what you see on the right is also a carbon capture technology, if you will. It's photosynthesis. And plants, whether it's a forest, whether it's a grassland, whether it's a coastal wetland, plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And in the case of the prairies, they pump carbon dioxide into the soil with that massive root system. This is a free good. If I had come up with a patent for photosynthesis, I think we would be seeing it used a lot more than it is currently in terms of our thinking about carbon capture and storage. What I can tell you is photosynthesis is an excellent solution. And at least on one level, it's free. It's free to landowners. And the real issue is going to be organizing landowners to move forward. And that's really the first part of the presentation. Will focus a lot on that organization and how we set this market up. Nature is an excellent solution. Next slide. Now, I'm an environmental lawyer, and I would say that my whole practice of law, my whole profession, all of my peers, we are about putting Band-Aids on an existing economic system. That system is really a post-World War II industrial system. We all know it here on the Houston Ship Channel on the coast. It's a system that basically leaked air pollution, water pollution, hazardous waste. And the Band-Aids that you see there are basically the various environmental laws that were passed to patch up that economic system that at best was leaky. Next slide, please. what I see coming in the future is a transition to where we are building an economy around nature to address the problems that essentially were created by a system that did not incorporate nature into its basic construct. And I think that in the best of the world that I can imagine in the future, we will have a relationship with ecology, with the natural cycle. So you'll hear a bit about the cyclical economy. I think, the hydrologic cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen, phosphorus cycles, all of those will be part of the economy of the future, which is going to be much more in tune with our ecological system. Next slide. Now, at the Baker Institute at Rice, we are working on liberating, on unleashing a market that is really has the potential to reach scale of carbon dioxide removal that is unprecedented, certainly in anything we've seen, because we've never tried to do this before. Basically, we're talking about planting seeds, we're talking about expanding ecological systems, we're talking about growing those systems, and essentially nurturing a market and expanding it over time into a solution to an environmental problem. This is not traditional environmental law thinking about how we solve problems. In fact, if anything, I am extremely concerned that we will overregulate this nascent market and basically keep it from coming into existence. We do not need regulation to enable a market. Basically, regulation is, I would argue, an older way of thinking. This is a different and new way of thinking about environmental protection. Next slide, please. Now, the work I'm going to be talking about really came out of post-Ike research at the Rice University Speed Center. What you see on the right-hand side of the slide is a flood control district image of, one, the pathway of Hurricane Ike, which came right up Galveston Bay. And secondly, the area inundated by Hurricane Ike, which was really to the east. I mean, we basically missed the direct hit by Hurricane Ike because the big surge is on the dirty side, which went to the east. That surge went at least 10 miles inland in Chambers County and Jefferson County, even further in portions of the Louisiana coast. Up on the top left, you see the surge returning back to the Gulf of Mexico 4 days after Ike passed. This is over in Jefferson County. And then you see 6 months later, the marsh system there. It's resilient, it's beautiful. And it basically was unchanged by Hurricane Ike, by a direct hit. Next slide. Now, what you see on the right-hand side, the map, is a 20-foot contour line along the Texas coast. We feel like the 20-foot in lower area of the coast is extremely vulnerable. And we really believe that development should not be encouraged in this area, and we should do everything we can to maintain nature, which can absorb and take the blow that a big storm surge would bring. This is primarily in private ownership. We know we're in Texas, we're not going to regulate to achieve this goal. So our goal became to pay landowners to maintain these lands. And we tried to find services, if you will, ecological services that we could pay these landowners for. And sequestration of carbon dioxide emerged as the #1 concept. Next slide. To take this concept further, we developed a concept which became the Texas Coastal Exchange, which is one of the projects that has been recognized by the Vision 2020 competition. But it basically recognizes that these natural ecosystems take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, store it in the soil, and that if we pay landowners for not only nurturing these systems, but expanding them, that we can have essentially carbon dioxide and ecological services. And along the coast in that red area that you see, we can also have coastal protection, a buffer zone, if you will, against surge, all paid for by carbon dioxide sequestration. We formed the Texas Coastal Exchange to begin to raise money and to get donations for carbon footprint sequestration and to pay landowners to protect and set aside these lands. And in 2020, we preserved about 10,000 acres and sequestered about 20,000 metric tons. Kirksey Architects, Valero, and Sprint Industries, Sprint Waste, all contributed to reduce their carbon footprint in this way and to protect and set aside these lands. Next slide. Now, at Baker Institute, we took the basic concepts that came out of the Texas Coastal Exchange and out of Speed Center, and we've turned it into sort of the big brother and big sister of Texas Coastal Exchange, where we're working to create the Texas carbon market. The Texas carbon market is essentially an effort to monetize carbon dioxide removal and storage by natural systems. First, to create it as a property right for landowners, then to set up a system where there are transactions between buyers and sellers. At Baker, we have a working group, a stakeholders group, that is really the glue that has held this whole project together. And we created a nonprofit called B Carbon, which will be issuing certificates later this year, and which has already pre-sold, or for others have pre-sold, about 70,000 tons of credits, including some credits in the UK for carbon neutral beer, that will be processed through the B Carbon system. Next slide. The stakeholder group that we formed, about 170 individuals are on the mailing list. This is open to anyone. If you're interested in participating with this B Carbon system, send me an email to blackburr, no N, just blackburr@rice.edu. I'd be happy to put you on the mailing list and invite you to participate. We have about 70 kind of organized entities, about 170 individuals. And the system that we've developed was developed by these participants. Next slide. The current international system is not working. That's basically what we discovered with a lot of our research. And in order to basically create this market, we had to go out and create our own standards. Those standards were created by the working group, by the stakeholder group I just told you. We have essentially a soil measurement protocol. All of the credits that are issued here are measured, and so that they will be reliable, and the landowners must commit to a minimum of 10-year retention of the carbon in the soil for each year's transactions, which we believe with the vibrant market will be decades of carbon sequestration and protection. Next slide. The beautiful thing about nature as a solution is you get co-benefits. We get water resilience, we get carbon resilience, economic resilience for both the agricultural industry and for the emitters, the oil and gas industry, ecological resilience, and we are the first to put a diversity, equity, and inclusion provision into the system. Next slide. Now, why am I talking about this in Houston? 500 million metric tons of direct emissions are represented by about 15 companies. They're color coded over here. I haven't identified them. If you put their full scope 3 use supply chain footprint, they're about 2 billion metric tons. The United States produces about 6.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So what we're talking about is a huge contribution by one region. If we got behind carbon sequestration, both in nature and in all the other alternatives that are out there, we could have such a huge impact globally with in this case, just 15 companies. Next slide, please. What could that achieve? We could easily see 800 million metric tons of carbon dioxide capacity in the grasslands and in converted croplands of the United States. That doesn't include the forests, which are shown in green. Cropland is in brown. Yellow is the grasslands of the United States. Much of this, and particularly in the grasslands, is privately owned. And we believe that this could become the largest land conservation, the largest ecological conservation program in United States history, as well as a major removal of carbon dioxide. Next slide. So basically, we're talking about using carbon payments to create this 20-foot infrastructure. Next slide. And we're talking about adding this to existing systems that are proposed for the coast. We've got to protect ourselves from hurricane surge. The refining industry is too vulnerable. The Corps of Engineers is proposing sand dunes, a barrier system across Bolivar roads to connect with the Galveston seawall to provide a coastal barrier. And another of the award winners, designed by Speed Center and Rob Rogers, is the Galveston Bay Park Plan that will be the inside, potentially of the inside portion of a long-term solution for this hurricane surge problem. Next slide. Together, these various concepts could come together to really transform the Texas coast. It's easy to see a green infrastructure. Sand dunes expanded with the core project in the red and black line. The yellow lines representing another part of the core projects, which is ecological restoration and erosion control along the coast. You have the barrier that is proposed across Bolivar Roads in blue. Galveston Bay Park Plan going up through the middle to protect the purple area, which is the energy and industrial base of the Houston region. Next slide. Together, I think all of these suggest that we need to embrace ecology. We need to embrace the earth. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. That's very impressive. And I already have a lot of questions. I'll try to stifle them so the other participants can ask their questions. So next up is Emily Reichert.
Well, thank you, Bob, and good evening, everyone. Very glad to be here this evening, and I don't know about you, but I'm feeling pretty inspired after that last presentation. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking a bit about Greentown Labs, which is the organization I run. And specifically, I'm going to talk about why we expanded to Houston, Texas, as our first ever out-of-state expansion from Massachusetts. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why and how we can do what we need to do that was discussed both early in the presentation by Bobby when we're thinking about what is the economy of the future for Houston, but also is reflected in Jim's presentation when we think about the big scale at which we need to be able to make things really change rapidly to address climate change. So next slide, please. So who is Greentown Labs? We are the largest climate tech incubator in North America, and I'll define that in just a moment. We were founded about 10 years ago in the Boston area by entrepreneurs who were basically graduating from a local university, didn't have a place to begin their companies because they needed to build things, because that's what you need to do in climate and clean tech. And you can't just use office space. So they banded together, and 10 years later, we are a business that is headquartered just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and newly opened in Houston, Texas. In Boston, we have 100,000 square feet of space. And you'll notice that our incubator is made up of not only office and event space, which is very common when you think about an incubator, a place where a lot of startups gather, but also laboratory space, because the type of startups that we support, climate tech startups, are building physical things. So these are not necessarily the app that you can build in a coffee shop and upload, and then you have customers. These are companies that are going to need to develop things by engineering, and there is science involved, and they're going to need to hire both of those science and engineers, and they are going to need a lab to do testing, and they are going to need partners to help them test their technology at scale. And so we spent the last 10 years building an organization that supports young companies in doing all of that. Next slide, please. So I said I'd define climate tech. So climate tech to Greentown Labs is basically tackling the largest greenhouse gas emitting sectors. We know from the IPCC reports that in order to keep global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to be decarbonizing, reducing the amount of emissions going into the atmosphere across every sector of our economy. So a lot of times when you think about climate or clean tech or energy transition, you might think about the electricity sector, and that's the right thing to think. That's solar, wind, other things that don't involve carbon. But there are also needs, as you just heard from Jim, in the agriculture sector. Transportation, we need to electrify our transportation system. Manufacturing processes are some of the most energy intensive, and those need to be involved evolved as well. And then finally, the buildings that we live in every single day have so many opportunities to become more energy efficient. And finally, another area that we see startups in, and increasingly as we've moved into the Houston context, is in resilience of infrastructure and people. And the way to think about that is, how do you protect the infrastructure that we have today? How do you understand what might be happening when there's a storm system? Can you have a networked set of sensors that help you understand what the conditions are across the city? Those are important pieces of data to have. And the entrepreneurs working at Greentown Labs, building startups, are working on all of these problems, really across climate tech sectors. Next slide, please. So I like to highlight our community, and I think it's a testament to both how hard the problem is, but also how many people there are committed to addressing climate change through technical solutions. Greentown Labs alone, we've seen over time about 350 companies that we've worked with, and those companies have raised capital that is 80% private capital, 20% public capital, $1.3 billion at this point to develop their technology. They've created 6,500 jobs, and they have a survival rate going through the incubator of Greentown Labs of about 88%. And so these companies continue to grow and thrive. They create jobs. And most importantly, they are addressing a big global challenge. And so as you can imagine, they get many of the best, most talented people to be working on these solutions who are also passionate about making a difference. I already mentioned our founding, but as you can see, our growth over the years has been basically a doubling every 18 months. And the important thing to know is that this business was founded by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs. So we've really kept that original community of entrepreneurs in mind as we've grown. And that creation of a community of entrepreneurs who can support one another is very important to helping these companies grow, because it is a tough thing to do, to be building a company that's focused on a climate solution. You have to hire engineers, you have to raise a lot of money, you have to do things in the lab that may not work, and all of these things are challenging. So when you have a community, that helps you on your way, on your journey to build your company. Next slide, please. So why Houston for Greentown Labs? So as I said, we grew up in the Boston area, and that's a place where people think about when they think about innovation and universities that are generating this innovation. You know, you might think of Boston or Silicon Valley. Those are the places where this happens, right? Well, we would beg to differ, and we would say that Houston actually has its own contributions to offer that are very unique in terms of climate solutions and startups. So why Houston for us? Well, clearly it's the global energy capital. I don't think anyone can dispute that. The question is, can it be the energy transition capital of the world? And I would argue that it can, and it is moving in that direction, which is amazing. Greentown from the very beginning has received incredible support from both the city of Houston, from the mayor's office, but also from the business community in Houston. And here I give a shout out to the Greater Houston Partnership, who has been a wonderful supporter throughout our process of opening and expanding into Houston, which has happened over the last 2 years. From the very early exploration of doing this, the Greater Houston Partnership and many others who have been introduced to us over this time period have been amazing champions and have really made this possible. And to me, that indicates a commitment to Houston being the energy transition capital of the world. What we learned in our very early meetings in Houston, and Bobby referred to this in his presentation, is that the innovation ecosystem, so a group of startups that is all working together in this particular sector, which is climate tech, clean tech, energy transition, you can use whatever words you like. There's not really a center point for this. There's not a convening organization that is bringing a bunch of young companies together and bringing around them all the resources that they need to be successful. And I'll talk about those in just a moment. There are many other organizations that support startups in the Houston area, and they absolutely are part of this broader fabric. of an ecosystem. But in terms of bringing together companies that are specifically focused on climate solutions, there wasn't really a single convening point, and we hope to be that in the Houston area. Next slide, please. Because our mission is really three things. And first and foremost, we're building that ecosystem. We're bringing people together that care about climate change, that are interested and have the experience to build technical solutions, but they might also have capital that they can invest in these solutions. They might also have business experience. There are so many different opportunities to get engaged in young companies who are building the next really generation of energy technologies. And so we're trying to bring all of those folks together in one place and help them get to know each other. Secondly, we foster startups. That's our bread and butter. So we have numerous programs and opportunities for startups to learn how to be good companies. They start out and they might be 2 or 3 people. They don't have a culture yet. They don't have a legal person on their team. They don't have knowledge of how to manufacture something, even if they do create something that works. And so we supplement all that by providing the services right on site so they can build their network while they're working in their office space and in their laboratory space. And then, of course, we provide a lot of different services around the lab, shared services like access to a machine shop, an electronics shop, and of course, a community of entrepreneurs. Third, we work with a lot of large companies. And this was also something that was referenced earlier in the presentation this evening. It is very important to understand that you can't do energy without scale. You absolutely can't solve a big challenge like climate change without scale. And both presentations prior to mine really emphasize this point. So a 2 or a 3 person company, or even a 10 or a 40 person company, may have a new innovative idea that is going to change energy forever. But if it isn't partnered with a larger company that can actually understand how to do that at a large scale, so it affects many, many people, that climate solution doesn't matter. So you need the large partners, and the large partners actually need young startups to help them with innovation, to help them to come up with the new ideas that are outside of the business that they currently have today. And a lot of the work we do is bringing those two sides together. And that is a very important part of the energy transition and new businesses being created and eventually growing and creating jobs in the area. Next slide, please. Oops, I think back one. So Greentown, Houston is our expansion into the Houston area. And here you see a few pictures of Greentown, Houston. You see an office space, which is filled with many desks. You see the front entryway there. We've actually taken over the old Fiesta supermarket in Midtown, and that building is providing a wonderful place to set up our laboratories, which is the third picture there. We offer these laboratories to entrepreneurs who are coming in and bringing whatever equipment they have, whatever experiments they have, and they set it up and they can build it in our laboratories. And then they can share all the resources and, frankly, the expertise that's existing in the incubator overall. So this is an incubator space. It is 42,000 square feet. We had our grand opening just a couple of weeks ago with Mayor Turner and many of our partners who helped us get here. And it is already filling up. We have about 28 young companies who are already moving in. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit about an ecosystem, and I wanted to dig into that a little bit further. So I mentioned that Houston has a lot of the ingredients for a healthy ecosystem. And this is an ecosystem in the sense of an ecosystem that supports startups. It's a different kind of ecosystem than the one that Jim was talking about. But basically it's the same concept. Startups are really, in our world, the center of the universe. And so how do we support them? We support them by bringing together a lot of different organizations that can help them to grow as they start from very young companies to bigger companies that can then employ more and more people. So we typically need corporate partners, larger companies that can help them. Universities provide talent. Sometimes universities are actually the source of these young companies. Professional services providers like legal and accounting and HR and PR and marketing, all these things, these startups don't have any of that at the beginning. So they need those supports. Investors are obviously critical. You need the capital to grow your company, to hire your people, and to also build the equipment that you need to test whatever it is that you're developing. Then there's many other organizations in an ecosystem that are also supporting startups at different stages. So a university might support them at a very early stage, and they might go through a business plan competition. Then they go through what's called an accelerator program, which is a boot camp. And then eventually they get to the incubator once they've raised a little capital and they are ready to start building the company in earnest. And then finally, government can also play a role, like we've seen with the city of Houston supporting Greentown Labs, helping us to really be part of this larger community of folks that are committed to climate action. Next slide, please. I wanted to introduce you to our Houston members, and a question I get frequently in my Boston context, which is where I am today, is, are all the startups in Houston just focused on helping the oil and gas industry to continue its current path? Or are they just helping the oil and gas industry reduce emissions? No, actually, the startups that we see in Houston are very similar to the startups we see in Boston. So we see startups that are working on transportation and electrifying that. We see many who are involved in the electricity sector and making that carbon free. A lot of companies who are working in resilience, and I'd say that that is more common in Houston than it is in Boston. Buildings, making buildings more efficient, agriculture, manufacturing. So there are a variety of different companies already here in the Houston area. And so we're here to help them grow and help them form a community. Next slide, please. I mentioned the importance of collaboration between young companies and larger companies. And this group of companies are the ones that helped Greentown come here because they are committed to the energy transition and they are committed to helping these young entrepreneurs to grow their companies. And so all of these folks, whether they're from the traditional energy industry, whether the financial industry, some of them are in renewable energy, some are utilities, some are data and tech. All of these companies together are really needed in order to move us all forward faster relative to these young companies that have technology. They're going to need all of these things. They're going to need all of these partners. And it's our job to help connect them so that they can scale their technology as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. And I'll end by just thanking our wonderful Houston Founding Advisory Board. These folks have been the ones that have been champions for us, helping us make connections, and also increasingly helping our startups to get connected to who they need to be connected to in the Houston ecosystem. And finally, we see this group as really thought leaders for the energy transition and helping the city of Houston, to implement and think about how do you accelerate the climate action plan that was announced on the last Earth Day. That's what this group will be working on. And I will end it there. And I believe we will open it to questions next. So thank you, Bob, and thank you all for listening.
Emily, thanks so much. And I neglected to say earlier, I apologize for this, but please post your questions in the chat. And David Robinson's going to try to help me keep track of that and get you in some order that makes sense. But while we're waiting for you to do that, Emily, let me ask you first. What you shared looks a lot like co-working / makerspace. I think of Plug and Play, for example, where Google was born, et cetera. But other than the green tech focus, what are the other differentiators between that kind of an environment and what you're creating?
Well, I mean, all organizations that do the co-working or maker spaces, they each have an individual place in the ecosystem. So I don't think there's necessarily, there's a role and a place for everyone that has organizations like these. For Greentown, our focus is really singularly on startups. So we don't allow anyone who can just pay for a desk to come and take space. And so that's an important differentiator. Second, we particularly focus on helping companies that are working on climate tech solutions. There are no other companies in Greentown Labs, so they have to be working on these things. And third, we provide a set of resources that are very specific to hardware companies. So I said machine shop and electronic shop, but we also have a whole slew of folks that help the companies to manufacture, to set up their first supply chain. We have organizations that help companies with the software tools they need to do modeling to understand how it is that their product will look before they even make it physically. So there are a lot of things that we provide that are very specific to helping hardware companies. And that knowledge base has really been built up over many years. And so we help companies in that way. So that is actually pretty unusual for a space of this type. You could call it a maker space. We call it a prototyping lab because it is really dedicated to allowing climate tech startups to set up laboratory space that they can operate in the way that they see fit to test their technology.
Exciting. Well, it should be a rocket boost for the Houston community in sorting this out. Jim, let me go back to you for a minute, if I may. That was a very inspiring and impressive presentation. And you mentioned, of course, the advantage of prairie grasses and deep root plants as a real agent in sequestering carbon. You didn't mention trees in that category, and I'm wondering about the role that trees and forests play in sequestration, and could it also be agroforestry, and could there be multiple incomes on the property while you're sequestering carbon, building topsoil, and collecting crops, in addition to then carbon credits, maybe? So can you say more about that? You have to unmute, sorry.
Sorry about that. Absolutely, Bob. I mean, forests certainly fall within the ecosystems that sequester carbon dioxide. They have quite a good rate of sequestration. We did not start off with forests just simply because we were working here on the Texas coast in the grasslands of the prairies. It turned out the prairie systems are the least, if you will, well understood from a carbon standpoint, and they were the biggest opportunity where essentially there was not a viable system globally. There are some viable systems out there for forests, although they suffer the same types of problems that the soil systems do. I would say that there is a tremendous opportunity for both soil storage in prairies and in coastal marshes, and possibly even in seagrass flats in the bays and estuaries. And then also for forest storage across the United States. We are expanding the bee carbon system into forests, probably in the fall time period. We are basically landowner friendly. We figure in the United States, if you do not recruit landowners and get them to participate, you're not going to have the scale that you need. So everything we have done has been to remove impediments for landowner participation. That includes what we call stacking of benefits. I would love to see landowners paid for half a dozen ecological services, one on top of each other, because that just keeps the sequestration in place and basically makes the ecosystem the basis of income. We think that there are bases for paying flood payments. We think there are water supply payments that could be made. And we know nitrogen and phosphorus removal payments are being made already in the Chesapeake Bay and up on the Ohio River. So there's a lot of opportunity.
So you mentioned also, I don't know if the phrase you used, regen ag or something as a part of the solution. And I've read about that, but I'm not too clear about it. I mean, Kiss the Ground made an impressive case, but to the average farmer, it looks like a lot of row crops, which would not be a big contributor to sequestration.
No, in fact, our rule structure basically is one of the few rules we have is no plowing. We do not want subsurface disturbance. We want to keep the carbon that's put in place in place. No-till farming techniques, however, were excellent. The group we're working with in the United Kingdom are doing no-till barley farming, and that's for their supply chain for beer. So that works very nicely, but we do not want subsurface disturbance of a major sort that you would get with plowing for row crops. Regenerative grazing is simply a way of mimicking the action of the buffalo over the prairies, for example. And the more we can mimic the natural system, and I mean, there was a lot of carbon that at one point had been sequestered in the Great Plains of the United States. We'd like to restore all of that and restore the Great Plains. And regen grazing is one technique, but mainly it's grassland restoration. And if we could restore the native ecosystems of the grasslands, however we get there, that would be a major goal.
There is one related question, I think, for Jim regarding the B carbon system.
Right.
There might be a preferred plant materials list with some specifics there.
Well, I think native, again, it's native ecosystems. And, you know, one of the things I think that certainly I'm a bit concerned with is there may be either genetically modified plant material or some plant materials that become a monoculture. And that is really something at this point we'd like not to see. We would like to see the native ecological system expanded. And you know, the plant systems from a native ecological system standpoint vary from region to region. It varies with rainfall, it varies with soil types. And basically you want to understand what was growing there 100 years ago and replicate it. You know, basically we don't want to do it over. We want to, if you will, we want to restore it. And I think that's a key aspect there. As a designer, just go back to where nature was 100, 200 years ago.
Biomimicry, we call that in architecture.
It's a good term.
And Janine Benyus coined that phrase, I think, and she said, why don't we just rely on nature? They got a 3.8 billion year head start on us.
You know, it's amazing though how much hubris we have. I mean, I would just think if Houston as a community embraced this concept and just said we're going to be about sequestration in natural systems, not to the exclusion of everything else, but just as part of a portfolio strategy. Those 2 million acres I was talking about along the coast, that's nothing. You could do that in a year, and it really is almost nothing. So, I mean, when we start thinking scale here, it's mind-blowing. And you can achieve a tremendous amount and actually not make a big dent in the carbon footprint.
So Jim, what about do you believe that the carbon offsets or some call the emerging carbon market will be a big part of this equation? And if so, does it take third-party certification, or could your institute, provide that? And if so, how?
Well, actually, B Carbon is a certification entity. We have formed it. We have created our own set of standards. We have a certification process, and then we will bring in outside third parties to verify the results that we are saying have been created. We will be evaluated by yet others. And so this is a very competitive system out there. There's frankly a lot of worthless credits out there. There's some credits that are very, very difficult to obtain. And we're trying to hit a practical kind of middle ground with a reliable, credible credit that doesn't frankly alienate every landowner that reads the terms and conditions. If we don't get the landowners, we will not get scale. And again, I think we've never ever thought of market as an environmental solution. And I think it requires creativity. And I think it requires a lot of people that have environmental prejudgments to frankly get rid of those, just like it requires the oil and gas industry to get rid of some of their prejudgments. I would tell you most of the oil and gas people we've talked to have never thought of nature as a solution to their problem. I think they usually think of it as being a problem. It's an impediment to doing a project or something like that. Here it's the partner. And the environmental community doesn't necessarily think that way either. Kind of like something I heard Bobby say, you know, if you've got sniping it from two different sides of an issue, you might be saying something right. This is one of those issues. It's getting sniped at from both directions. And I just think it's part of a portfolio. It's not the solution, but it is a very good solution. And I just am fighting to see it included.
And Bobby,
one thing I might add to Jim's comments, Bob, if you don't mind, is
no,
that,
please.
A couple of weeks ago, ExxonMobil announced their desire to lead a project in the Houston Ship Channel that would ultimately sequester, I think, Jim, remind me, I think the number was 50 megatons of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, at a minimum.
At a minimum. And their estimate is that would cost $100 billion to do. Get your head around that. $100 billion. It would go to 50 point sources of carbon emissions. It would build a major CO2 pipeline, and it would ultimately inject that CO2 into deep saline caverns in the Gulf of Mexico and sequester it. You know, my question for Jim is, Jim, if we gave you $100 billion, how many grasslands could you plant? And you know, and how much carbon could you sequester? And my guess is an awful lot. With $100 billion.
I think I could get, $100 billion, $20 a ton right now. What's that, 5 billion tons?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if I got that much grassland, but or maybe 500 million. But it, you know, we can make a dent with with grasslands and with forests that at a very important level. And we can get to the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. The thing that's neat about what Exxon's doing is they're capturing at the basically at the outlet of the smokestack, and that's where you capture your CO2 because it's concentrated. Once it gets in the atmosphere, it's a whole different ballgame. That's where nature comes in.
So Bobby, so back to your clients and the people you work with, it seems to me from an outsider's point of view that the typical approach is to create a new technology to address these issues. And I guess what I'm wondering based on that exchange is what is the opportunity for a partnership between what Jim's talking about in natural systems and what industry has typically created technology to do?
I think the opportunities are fantastic. And in fact, I think that is actually recognized in some sense by the traditional oil and gas industry, because if you look at the net zero 2050 plans that have been put out by the major oil companies like BP and Shell, for example, all of those plans have two things in common. They both depend on technology improvements, i.e. on technologies that currently don't exist today, number one. And number two, they recognize that nature will have to play a role, and a really meaningful role, in this happening. The way they tend to talk about it is in terms of them either planting trees themselves or buying carbon offsets. And right now, if you kind of dig into these net zero 2050 plans, not just from oil companies, but from Microsoft or Amazon or you name it, basically everyone is using major carbon offsets to get to their numbers. Well, Jim, you tell me, but those carbon offsets ultimately have to come from somewhere, right? And so I think there's at least an implicit recognition in the oil industry world that nature-based solutions are going to have to play a major role if we ultimately are going to get to a true net zero future.
So another question for you, Bobby. In your presentation, you mentioned the hydrogen economy, and we've been, Dr. Ballard, who invented the hydrogen fuel cell, promised me, I think it was in 1989, that he would have a commercial car available in 5 years. And I bought my first hybrid in 2000. It was the Insight, the Honda Insight. And I said when I bought it, I'm only going to drive this long enough for the hydrogen fuel cell car to appear, which, as you probably know, just appeared this year in California, made by Honda. And I'm driving that same car, but in Kansas City, Missouri. So it's a hybrid here because there's no hydrogen infrastructure. And and I've been very interested in this, but it seems like it's been very slow coming. And so What's your perspective on this, and what industries in Houston are working to advance the whole hydrogen economy?
Yeah, it has been frustratingly slow, Bob. That's for sure. The technology is understood. It's a matter of cost, and what is particularly costly in hydrogen is the transportation and storage of it. And this kind of goes back to the fundamental challenge in changing energy systems. You know, energy systems operate in the physical world, and it's a matter of moving things and storing things, and there are limits to the laws of physics and chemistry. And so, you know, we have been working very hard to make progress in driving down the cost of moving and storing hydrogen, but as yet we are still quite a long ways away from making that work. Now, at some level of scale, what's called blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen that's produced using natural gas as a feedstock, has become closer and closer to being commercially viable on a larger scale. The real holy grail there is what's called green hydrogen, where the power source comes from either solar or wind-based electricity. And we are still, we think, multi-decades away from having green hydrogen being commercial on a large scale. That being said, that's a space where Houston, we think, is actually very, very well placed to be a leader. And it's for several reasons. One is our access first to cheap and reliable natural gas. And then secondly, when it comes to green hydrogen, to large scale wind and solar, both of which exist in Texas. We have a lot of infrastructure that's currently already in place that is convertible, which is to say natural gas pipelines that may currently only be able to take about 20% hydrogen can be refitted to carry up to 100% hydrogen. That infrastructure in Houston is already in place. We have big producers of hydrogen and big consumers of hydrogen on the ship channel in Houston. So much in the same way that the Houston Ship Channel is a fantastic laboratory, if you will, for carbon capture and sequestration, it's also a fantastic laboratory for hydrogen. And it's our desire at the partnership to make sure we get the jump on that. Right now, in other parts of the world, in particular in the Netherlands and in northern Germany, there are two major hydrogen projects going on. Both of them are heavily subsidized by the government to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. That's probably ultimately what it's going to take here as well. But there's no better place in the world to do that than in our region. And we just need to make sure that when it happens here.
And we assume when it happens that Greentown will provide some of the technology, right, Emily?
Well, actually, I was going to say we have a company that is doing exactly that for the transportation sector. Ibis Energy Systems has created refueling, they call them appliances for hydrogen cars. And we have one outside of our building in Somerville. That was installed back in 2017. And we have 2 hydrogen cars that live at Greentown Labs Houston, or sorry, Greentown Labs Somerville, I should say. And this system has been deployed in Japan. It is also increasingly, it's being deployed in Australia now. And so there are places around the world where hydrogen transportation is actually becoming a thing. And I'm pleased to tell you that there are multiple vehicles that you can purchase. The one problem in our area, and actually this could be a place where Houston has a leg up, is that regulations are such that you can't drive the hydrogen vehicles through our tunnels. So they have a limited ability to get around in Boston and in New York. But perhaps you guys can handle that better in Houston.
Yeah, not a whole lot of tunnels.
That's right.
So David, do you see questions that I don't? I'm not.
Bob, I do. You may hear my dog. Apparently she is reminding us that we have now exceeded the time that we intended for this panel.
Okay.
We're here, so my apologies for her, but boy, this has been an exciting conversation. We do have a few more questions in the Q&A. And for those who have submitted those questions, I want to reassure you that we will get those answered and get them to you. So appreciating all the attendees and the very interesting discussion that we've had tonight. I know what you all have contributed today, and for that I'm very, very grateful. This is the last of the panel discussions, but I think, Bob, with your help and your great leadership on the jury, I want to thank you both from the chapter of AIA Houston, as well as from the city of Houston in this unique and first of its kind collaboration. Emily, for your arrival in Houston, thank you for being here. Bobby, for your leadership. Keep up the good work, keep up the good fight, and let's live into Jim Blackburn's vision here for the coast and our broader region. There's much work to be done. For that, I am very, very grateful. And Bob, I think with that, I might suggest that we are adjourned.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody, for participating.
Thank you for having us.